Let's talk supply chain.
All right. So we are just getting started. We've just opened the doors for the attendees to join us for the webinar today. So we're just going to give it a few minutes to let everybody in and let everybody join us today before we get started. And then we will jump in and give you a bit of an overview as to what we're going to be talking about today, who my guests are, who I am, and we're going to be talking all about global expansion from an HR perspective. And we know that a lot of companies are looking to do that right now because it's really the future of the industry. It's the future of business. And so we are going to be talking all about that today. So just stay tuned with us for just another minute or so while we let everybody into the webinar and get started. And for participating today, you do get a free ebook from us, which we're going to be talking about too, which is going to go through everything that you need to know about global expansion and give you some tips and tricks to be able to do that as well. So just about another 30 seconds to make sure that we've got everybody, and then we will kick it off and get started. It is Thursday today, and I hope you guys are all having a great week. It's Friday Eve, as most people are talking about it, or talk about Thursday. All right. Let's get started. So hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar brought to you by Nucleus, the global expansion experts. My name is Sarah Barnes-Humphrey. I'm the founder and host of Let's Talk Supply Chain and Blended, and I will be your host for today's webinar. I've worked with Nucleus a few times now, so if you've attended one of our previous webinars, welcome back. It's good to see you again, and if this is your first, we'll get ready for a super insightful session. Before we kick it off, I want to let you know that we will be running a few polls a little later on. Plus, we're going to be taking questions throughout the discussion today, and we will answer those questions at the end of the discussion. And as far as the polls are concerned, it's great to hear your perspective. So make sure to look out for those. And as a thank you for attending today, we'll also be giving you a little freebie as well as it's jam-packed with insights and actionable takeaways to help you go global. And I'll share that with you towards the end of the session. So today we are diving into a day in the life of an HR executive and looking at how they approach international expansion. All businesses are currently facing incredibly challenging times. Inflation is at a high. We are technically already in a recession. Leaders are tasked with attempting to achieve profitable growth in a volatile climate while costs spiral out of control. So businesses are having to get creative and really focus in on how they can realistically weather this storm. And research shows that despite cost concerns, business leaders are addressing these issues by actually increasing investments in what they see as the top drivers of growth for the next year or two. According to a recent survey, 77% of executives say hiring and retaining talent is their most critical growth driver, and 42% of companies say going global will be central to success. So when we look at these issues that are at the heart of growth for so many businesses, first, it is clear that they can be addressed with international expansion. And second, they fall firmly onto the plates of HR and finance leaders. So today I'm joined by Tracee Comstock, Vice President of Human Resources at Nature Sunshine Products, where they manufacture health and wellness products, and she's been in the industry for over 30 years. Plus, we've got Dr. Shan Nair, President at Nucleus, with us today, and we're going to do a deep dive into an HR executive's perspective on going global, the benefits and challenges, the processes involved, and tackling the issue of the moment, which is talent. So let's get this discussion started, and by setting the scene. So Shan, welcome to the discussion. And, I touched on a few statistics in the introduction, but from an HR executive's perspective, why should a business consider going global? What are some of the benefits? What issues does international expansion tackle and really help to resolve?
First of all, it's a pleasure to be here and to be joined by Tracee. Thank you very much. The main reasons why a business goes global in the current environment is because it wants to maximize its value. Maximizing value is particularly important in a recession because values are coming down. So anything you can do to maximize the value of your business is something that you would want to seriously think about and action. A company that's simply US centric with US customers and with an offering that isn't particularly attractive internationally will, however successful it is in the US, attract a lower value than an equivalent company offering a similar product or offering that actually is slightly different but has international appeal. Because a potential buyer can see that by buying this company at a discount or at a reduced price in the current environment, they can actually achieve a much higher return by boosting the sales and therefore the profitability of the business internationally. Often large companies, like Cisco and Intel already have very substantial international marketing and sales networks. And they can see that by plugging in your company's service offering into that network, they can achieve maybe 1,000 or 100 times the sales that you've managed to achieve internationally. So a company's motivation in going international is not so much to sell wide scale. It's to show a potential investor that, yes, these products and services can indeed be sold internationally. I believe that is a driving force for companies going abroad, and going international in a recession when cash is tight is often looked upon as something you don't want to do. In fact, it is something that you should be doing because you want to maximize it, because the M&A market will pick up because companies are going to be looking predatorily to buy other companies on the cheap. So anything you can do to increase your attractiveness or your value or a combination is something you should be thinking about if you're intending to exit your business in the next couple of years. So I believe that's the primary reason why companies go international. Obviously, there are many challenges that fall from that, but that is, I believe, a primary cause.
Yeah, and it's a really good time to be able to do that, even from a marketing perspective. A lot of people reduce what they do in marketing, and now's the time to really up what you're doing in marketing while all of your competitors are reducing it. So in a variety of different ways, taking a look at it from different perspectives is really going to give you that competitive advantage in, a moment in time and what we're dealing with at this moment. So Tracee, welcome to this discussion. What are your thoughts on what Shan just shared with us and how you view international expansion?
Well, Sarah, great to be here. And Shan, great points. I think when a company decides to expand internationally, they want to make sure that their products do appeal to consumers and to customers, and that there's going to be a need out there. I think when it comes to global expansion, especially where we've got inflation and we've got the rise in cost of goods, having and being able to get products in market is something that appeals to a lot of consumers. I think we've seen that Amazon and some of the companies like that, the direct to consumer strategies that a lot of companies have put into place, that's really changed kind of the face of how consumers want to get products quickly delivered to their doorstep. And I think it's very important when you look at global expansion that you work with a third-party expert like Nucleus. And I've worked with Nucleus in the past at some tech companies and some health and wellness companies, and they're phenomenal just in providing key data and information about global expansion to help you to be successful in putting your business strategies together.
Absolutely. I mean, we're hearing all sorts of things about, how data can help in that decision making. And I think we're going to be talking a little bit more about how that can help as well. So as an HR executive, I mean, you really need to have the ability to make smart and strategic decisions, like you just talked about, on behalf of the entire organization, and be able to look holistically at the company and understand what it needs. So how should an HR executive look at their own organization and analyze it with those wider benefits in mind, right? To decide whether or not international expansion is a beneficial route. So Tracee, I'm going to go to you for this one and maybe talk us through what that looked like for you and how you made those decisions as well.
I think stepping back as a global HR leader and having worked on that in the past, global expansion can be expensive, and you've got to make sure that you put a business strategy together and that you collaborate with a lot of the key stakeholders in the organizations. And you may have a CFO you need to talk with, your CEO, you may have someone that's over international sales that you want to collaborate and work with, you may have your global GM that works in the market. And just as you look at that global expansion, it's putting those heads together and having discussions about the collaboration. You want to do your due diligence just in looking at the market itself. And that's where I come back to really working with someone like Nucleus, because Shan provides excellent advice and really can help. Just he and his team can help just with how to manage things. There might be government requirements or regulations that you need to follow, and you want to make sure that you minimize the risk for your company. As you move forward with those strategies, you want to make sure that you do it right. And so I would just say, take it a step at a time. Get those folks together. You might have your legal and general counsel that's working with you as well, but get those teams together and then make sure that you manage it properly. I know there's several examples that Shan may want to share of different case studies or situations in different countries, but just for example, in Latin America and Mexico, you've got to make sure that when you look at the total salaries, when you start to hire people, you've got to pay a 13th and a 14th salary to those folks to take care of bonuses and vacations. And there's just certain dynamics and certain information that you need. And so having that global expert can be really helpful. For public companies, you might also want to talk to some of your accounting firms that you work with. They may do your audits on a regular basis. They can provide insights, as well as some of your benefit providers. When you look at the benefits, especially if you worked in socialized countries, you may have requirements with healthcare, with pensions, all of those things come into place, and also managing payroll properly. So there's a lot of dynamic information and a lot of key information, and it changes from time to time too. So that's what's great about having that third-party subject matter expert like Shan and their team, so that they can reach out when there's changes in the laws and help keep you updated on those things. So
well, and you mentioned there's so many things to think about and consider. And you mentioned that it is, a costly endeavor, but it gets even more costly when you don't do it right the first time. So Shan, did you want to jump in here with maybe some of those examples that Tracee was talking about?
Well, I think the first thing you need to do is to make sure that Tracee's already mentioned it, internal communication. So you can have everything set up. You can have your local country compliant employment agreements done. You can have all the terms put in there that protect you to the maximum. But if you don't communicate internally properly, you could end up with a VP of sales deciding to hire someone in a hurry. And in order to lock the person in, doesn't tell you and just sends off a US offer letter, which is completely invalid. And through the issue of which you've lost the right to reserve terms that you could otherwise have reserved as an employer. So internal communication is very important as a first step, that everybody in the team, from the sales VP, the CFO, the CEO, they all understand that there is a process to be followed when you hire somebody abroad. This is the process, and this is how you need to follow it. You can't just knee jerk and do whatever you want. So there has to be some agreement that, the VP of sales says, yeah, jobs are tight. I need to lock this person in. There has to be some agreement between the sales and the HR side, that when HR gets that note saying, I need an offer letter or an employment agreement, it's all teed up to issue it right away. Because often it's the pressure of getting that letter out that causes the problem. Equally, when you want to terminate somebody, we had one case where there was a UK salesperson, and the VP of sales just called him on the phone and said, "You're fired."
Oh,
and he rubbed his hands in glee, because he was going to get several months of salary as compensation for as damages through the act in which the way in which he was fired. There is a process called a performance improvement plan that needs to be followed before you can terminate an employee who's unsatisfactory. And the company as a whole needs to know what that process is and follow it. Otherwise, there'll be a large liability. So in the particular case of this person, the employment tribunal awarded him 9 months of salary when the company needs to have paid him 1 month if they played the whole process the correct way. So I think it's internal communication, actually, more than external, is absolutely key. And for the HR department to know in advance the thinking of the company, so there are documents like employment agreements that need to be issued in a hurry that are required. They can be prepared and ready to hand.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, the pandemic has really shown that we can hire anywhere, really anywhere,
Yes.
and we can work from anywhere. And so this is a really key point, because a lot of times we're talking about how there isn't potentially enough talent for particular roles. But so we have a lot of options and we have a lot of opportunity, but with that comes responsibility, and we need to know what that responsibility really is. And so a very, very timely topic, and I'm glad that we're talking about this today. So now you both identified the potential that international expansion could bring to your organization. So what does a day in the life of an HR executive actually look like when they're taking this kind of project on? So Tracee, walk us through what that has looked like for you when, the company has said, okay, one way or another, we're looking at international expansion. What is that responsibility, and what did that look like for you when they decided to do that?
Yeah, great question. And I think, as far as international expansion and the day in the life of an HR person, it's all about priorities and really trying to prioritize your schedule. And I think you bite off the elephant one piece at a time. Again, gathering that due diligence, talking with those stakeholders, having communication up and down, like Shan talked about internally, as you look to expand into those areas. And then it's about building a total rewards program to attract and retain top talent. And I think that's very important when you get ready to work on your global expansion, because you've got to make sure, if you've got to obtain real estate, in some of those countries, and if you've got to have a place for those employees to work, there's just a lot of steps that go into that. And I know here at Nature Sunshine, we've got some great operating business unit leaders that manage a lot of those details and work really hard to make sure that we get top talent, and to make sure that our total rewards package is a good package. And then also, I think, continuing to make sure that those employees know they're cared about. When we had the pandemic hit, with COVID in particular, I mean, some of our team in China, they were on lockdowns and really couldn't even get out of their apartments. And so we had to get food delivered to them to make sure that they were taken care of. And so I know that our operating business unit leader and the president over that group made sure that those people were taken care of. And I know it meant a lot to them. The total rewards package is wonderful, but it's all about touching the hearts of those employees globally and making sure that you're doing the right thing in taking care of your people. And so I would just say, in the day in the life, that's what you've got to remember above all else. You've got a lot of details to take care of, but remember that people matter, and that globally they want to be cared about, and they want to add value and contribute to the organization and be recognized for those contributions. So those are just a few thoughts on my end.
Yeah, no, those are great thoughts. And it's really indicative that it is a journey, right? It's not something that is going to start and stop when you decide to go for international expansion. It's really something that HR and the leadership team really have to take into account, because different things are happening in different regions all the time. And so you have to take not only a look at the people holistically, but also the regions and the places that they live as to what's happening, and keep on top of that, so you know what is happening in those team members' lives as well. So Shan, I want to ask you, walk us through what needs to happen. Like, who needs to be involved from a leadership perspective, or even, a team member perspective, and the process that engages in managing an international expansion?
I think the process generally should, but doesn't always, go as follows. First of all, the company and the business as a whole needs to be clear as to the objective that it's trying to achieve when it goes international. So what are you actually aiming to achieve? Based on what you're aiming to achieve, you should then work out what is the type of person or people that you want to hire that will help you achieve that. Thirdly, you then need to figure out where exactly are these people best located to enable you to achieve what you want to achieve. Once you've defined that, you've now got a country, you've got a job description, the type of entity that you set up, which is now a legal issue, not a legal department issue, not an HR issue, will fall out of the process. So really people say, oh, HR should go on the back of operations. No, HR comes first, and HR now determines the type of legal entity that you're going to have. And that in turn determines the type of compliances and requirements that you have. So I think that that's really where you have to be clear that, you know, what I want to do, how do I do it, where do I do it, who do I need to help me do it? And now once I've got that, I can go down the whole process of preparing employment agreements, figuring out benefits. You know, I tend to look at a lot of that as dotting the I and crossing the T. You've got a painting that you're trying to paint. You've sketched it out by determining where you want to go and who you want. And now you're making the fine detail, which is putting in place the benefits, the employment agreement, setting the entity up, registering it, things which are not HR related, but which are relevant. All that then follows. Conversely, if you're already in a particular country and you're growing, you need to be aware of works councils, because works councils are a requirement in many countries, even at a headcount as low as 15. And a lot of people think works councils are relevant to European countries, but they're also relevant, in fact, in Australia, they're relevant even in Morocco, they are relevant. So you need to keep abreast of changes of the legal requirements and also changes in the legal requirements, which is why at that point, it's absolutely critical that you have somebody helping you that is clued on, you know, isn't reactive and just answering questions when you ask them, but knows to tell you what questions you need to ask them to get the answer. Because often you don't know when laws change, but you need to be told so that you can then work out whether you need more advice or support or not, and then get it. So I think that's in a summary how you would operate.
And Sarah, if I can interject for just a second, and Shan, I think too, that's where that partnership comes in. You know, you may be working with your general counsel on defining the legal entity, and they may have, you know, some advisors or other attorneys in those countries that they work with. And so partnering with those stakeholders, and then in a public company too, you may have a board of directors. If you've got a CapEx expenditure, if you've got additional SG&A costs that you need to get approved in advance so that you can move forward with this global expansion. So all of those stakeholders, it's very important, again, that communication up and down internally, that you are in agreement that you want to move forward with this global expansion. And then I think with, you know, Shan's point too, having that strategic mindset, really moving on those strategies and making sure, just like with talking with someone like Nucleus that can tell you about work councils, you need that third-party expertise to really help you to successfully manage this, because you can't keep your eye on the whole world all at once, and you don't know all the laws, and you don't know all the changes that may occur. And that's why it's so important to have someone like Shan and their team to talk with, because it really helps to provide additional guidance and keep you on the straight and narrow in managing things right and taking care of your people.
Yeah, and I think the other thing to mention is that you're going to start somewhere, but the idea is to grow, right?
Exactly.
Grow that international expansion. And so where you start in that journey is going to change as you grow, as you bring more people on, as you look at new markets, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And like you said, you can't be everything to everybody, and you need to get notified when things change and how you need to be thinking about your business in those particular markets. And so, you know, it really is a collaborative effort, both internally and externally, and making sure that you have the right partners. Usually I have a sign behind me that says collaboration is the future of business. And it's
true.
So true, no matter what you're looking to do and what you're doing. So we're going to go to our first poll. So if we can get the poll up there, we do want to ask you a question. And that question is your company prepared to handle the changes in HR regulations for international employees? This is a great question because a lot of people are looking at international employees but don't really understand the responsibility that comes with it. So we're going to give you a minute to take a look at that poll and give us your answers, because we really want to have an idea what that looks like for you. And while we're doing that, Shan, I want to ask you a question. What is the most important skill an HR executive should have when managing international expansion? What does that look like?
I think Tracee mentioned it just earlier. Strategic mindset, I think, is the most important. There are other attributes, but the most important one is a strategic mindset, because the way HR operates, there are two faces to HR. There is the soft HR and there is the hard HR. The soft HR is aiming to ensure that the employees are properly motivated, properly rewarded, and are in a position where they wish to and give the best they can to the business. The hard HR is there to ensure that the employer, i.e. the business, is properly protected in the event of a negative situation arising with an employee, and that it has reserved for itself all the rights and responsibilities, that it can do, so that its position is protected to the maximum extent possible. But I think that strategic focus mindset is important, and it does tie in with having a partner that actually is proactive and works with you truly as a partner rather than an external consultant, to let you know when laws change in particular countries, etc. So having an advisor that simply says, well, this happened because you didn't instruct us to act for you on this, is not very helpful. What you need is someone that says, hey, the laws changed here, and you've got this many people. I think it impacts you. Can we talk? You need an advisor, whether it's Nucleus or somebody else, that operates in that way rather than in the way in the first way that I mentioned. I think that really is key, because you can't be all things to all people if you're in multiple countries. You need people to rely on.
Absolutely. And as we end that poll, I want to ask the audience, and make sure that you put your answers in the chat, because I want to see what your thoughts are on the most important skill an HR executive should have. Shan just mentioned strategic mindset. What do you guys think? Is it leadership skills, business intelligence, risk assessment skills, analytical skills, communication? So we want to hear from you. So put your answer in the chat. Now, the poll has come out with a resounding no. So 100% of you that answered the poll is saying no, that your company is not prepared for international employees. And so that really just goes to show that a lot of people are talking about it, thinking about it, but really don't have the resources to be able to implement it. Maybe think that they do, but don't actually know what's involved in doing that. So I think it's safe to say that going global is not easy or smooth. It's not a smooth process, right? So there are a lot of moving parts, which we talked about, and an HR executive has to cover a lot of ground and master a lot of skills, with the added task of making sure that all the numbers continue to add up. So what are some of the main challenges, Tracee, as an HR executive when they're looking down on an international expansion?
Well, I think we've kind of touched on some of them, but bottom line, you've got to make sure that you can minimize the gaps in knowing how to manage employees in those countries. And I think, again, working with Nucleus and working with some of your advisors, whether, again, it's your legal advisors or it may be your finance and accounting advisors, but really making sure as you gather that due diligence. And that's what's so great, I think in working with Shan and his team, is that they will provide due diligence in many of these areas and validate the things that you need to do, and then also alert you right before if there's some payment that needs to be made, or if there's some taxation that needs to be taken care of. They're really good to stay on top of that and to make sure that gets on your calendar, because again, you can get busy managing a lot of things in many areas globally, and you don't want to miss doing something that you should, because that causes risk. And I think Shan's seen times when companies haven't managed it properly. And then as you get ready to expand, there's going to be some CapEx costs. You may not build that profitability for a few years. So you've got to invest your time and your energy to stay focused and to keep working with those teams as you start to build that profitability and build the revenue. If you have to end up moving an expat, a lot of times you'll hire in country, but you may
Yes.
have an expat, and there's a lot of costs involved in that.
Very
And you
true.
need to make sure you manage that properly as well. So I think having that expertise and guidance really provides the confidence to me and the comfort that we're narrowing that gap and making sure that we manage it properly and that we work with those government entities in the right way. Because the last thing you want to do is impact your reputation in a negative way in those countries. And you can have the best products in the world, but if you don't manage things from a compliance standpoint and a regulatory standpoint, you're not going to have a good reputation. And so it's very important all around that you do the right thing, that you take care of your people, and that you also take care of following the laws and the regulations in those countries, and that you do it with integrity. Most companies have code of conducts. If there's any suppliers you work with, also making sure that they're taking care of their people properly, because again, it all comes back and can impact you, especially in this social media world that we have right now.
Yes, impact brand, there's cancel culture and all of that you need to be thinking about. And then you bring up a good point. Do we hire within that country? Do we move somebody into that country? If we are going to move somebody into that country, what do they need to know culturally? Who do they need to be as a person to be able to make a successful entry into that market? All of these are key things to think about when you are expanding and looking into, international markets. Now, Rhonda says, for leadership skills, combo of abundance of skills based upon the company's vision, mission, and culture. So she actually thinks that all of the above are critical to an HR executive, really making an international expansion successful. So Tracee, when you were going through this, what did you have to think twice about? What was something that maybe surprised you about the process, or, what your thoughts of international expansion was versus what it actually is in reality?
Well, I think we have to be careful not to put our US hat on, if we're working in the United States, because sometimes we think, just like Shan talked about, just sending an offer letter, you just get it done. No, you've got to be careful, you manage it, and you need to pay them in the local currency, because otherwise you might end up paying them a lot more or paying them less. It just depends on how that exchange rate works out. So I think when there's gaps and things like that, things that make you think twice, it's just making sure you understand the laws and the regulations in those countries as you're building that total rewards package. And like Shan said, you're dotting your I's and crossing your T's. You've got to make sure you get your legal entity set up. If you have an expat that may be moving there, again, you try to hire in country if you're able to do that. But if you have an expat that you have to move, you might have to plan 6 months to 9 months to a year ahead to make all of that happen for them to be able to get into a home or to be able to rent a place. It just depends on, how they want to manage that financially for themselves. And so you've just got to work on that ahead of time before you get ready to start launching products in that country. And then you might also have some supply chain issues as you're trying to get products there. You've got to plan in advance so that you're not, you don't have out of stocks and those types of things, so that when they do get ready to sell those products, that those products can be there and be there for the customers and the clients and be delivered on time, so that your reputation is good. So those are some of the things that I think about.
Free trade agreements, how much shipping is going to
Absolutely.
cost into this new market. And I recently, found out a little bit more about banking in other countries as well. And if you can't do banking right away in that country, you might be paying somebody by wire, and you don't want them to have to, maybe pay that wire transfer fee that you didn't even know existed, but could really damage your relationship because they don't want to bring it up. And anyways, there's so much to think about. And so I'm so glad that we're talking about this today. Is there any concerns that maybe you have now that you didn't have before, that you can share with us?
And did you want me to share that, or Shan?
Oh, sorry, Tracee.
Oh, yes. I think just just in preparation on working in those strategies, as I look at that list of what's important in managing international expansion, I think that strategic mindset's so important. That you look at things a step by step, and that you manage things. And then if you have employee issues, I noticed there's a few questions in the Q&A and the chat that we'll probably get to at some point, Sarah. But I think just if you end up having a situation where maybe you didn't hire the right person, you've got to then work with your legal team, again, work with Shan and their team at Nucleus and other experts, just to make sure, if you do have a severance package you have to provide, that you're working with those work councils and that you're tying that all together to make sure you manage both the hiring and the firing. The goal is to attract and retain top people.
Yes.
So I would just say one thing in your hiring decisions: be careful. Make sure that you've got those stakeholders involved in the interview process, and even involved in interviewing the person, to make sure you're making the right hiring decision, because you want someone to be with the company long term. And it's important that as you work on future strategies that you move forward. I don't know if that answered your question or not, but those are some of my thoughts.
Well, and I think, our workplaces have changed, and I'm going to send this one over to Shan. But before I do that, I just want to remind everybody, if you have any questions, make sure to put it in the Q&A, because we are going to get to those in probably about 10-15 minutes time. And we want to make sure that we answer all of your questions today. So Shan, we've had a lot of changes in our workplaces, right? With the pandemic, people working remote and hybrid and all that kind of thing. What surprises your customers the most when you look at them broadly about international expansion that maybe you hear over and over and over again?
Basically, I think the main things to worry about, as opposed to be surprised about, because you don't want to get a surprise. You want to worry about it and sort it out so that you don't get a surprise. Is first to actually check where your employees actually are.
That is so true.
Might sound like a silly point, but we have had cases, for example, where during the pandemic, a UK employee went off to his family in Malta, didn't tell anyone, turned up at all the meetings properly. And we find out 2 years later that we've been running UK payroll for him when he's been living and working in Malta, and the company had no entity or anything set up in Malta. So there's a non-compliance. So I think you need to be sure, when everybody's remote, exactly where are they all, and where are they working from, and for how long. I think that is actually something that soft HR can do, because soft HR is there to make life easy for an employee, and particularly when you have a stressful situation like a pandemic or like the hurricane that we recently had here in Florida, that you know where they all are, so that you can handle their benefits and payroll properly. I think so communication is really important. On the flip side, just focusing on a couple of points that were made about expats. Actually, expats also drive the type of entity that you need. For example, if you are sending an expat to Australia, you have to have an Australian subsidiary set up to act as the sponsoring employer. There's no point in worrying about what type of entity should I have. It's a no-brainer. You have to have a subsidiary, even if it's for one person, to be the sponsoring employer. So sometimes the expat issues, just like other HR issues, drive the tax and the legal setup issues rather than the other way around. So I think that's a brief answer to your question. Know where your employees are, be in regular touch with them, especially with international employees, where they can feel, if they're small in number compared to the headcount in the head office, they can feel like they're out on a limb and they're not really loved. So you have to give them extra TLC. And as part of that TLC, you find out where they are, what their issues are. Also, sometimes when you're setting up going abroad, you're not doing it actually to increase sales. You're doing it to set up an engineering center or a technical resource center because resources for that are tight in your country. At that point, I think it's important to understand the local culture and to make sure that the management you put in actually understands that local culture and operates the company as if it were a domestic company rather than how you would operate in the US. So, for example, what do I mean by that? I mean things like unlimited leave, which is quite popular in the US. Take that to India. And the employees will say, well, they'll actually be dissatisfied because they'll say, we don't know whether we can take leave or not.
Mm.
So, effectively, are you saying that we are not allowed to have any leave? Is that what the plan is? It's better to be specific and to say you have X days of leave in a year, and then everybody knows where they stand. So things that we take for granted here as actually being a good employer can end up giving you the image of a bad employer, or an employer that you have to worry about all the time in a foreign country. So I think those are kind of just a few simple examples, but you have to be sensitive to the foreign culture and work ethic.
Well, and we don't want those bad reviews. I have another question around the consequences of that non-compliance. What does that look like? And have your customers been surprised at maybe the size of consequence that could really happen for non-compliance? Sean?
Yes. The answer is yes. They have. But most of the costs have been really in two areas. Either you've got yourself set up the wrong way and you've got a tax problem with interest and penalties, or you've mishandled an employee and put yourself in a position where you're going to have a damages award of significance against you. I think it's one of those two things. What you definitely don't do is ignore a summons from a court, which one of our clients did in Switzerland. Just ignored it, didn't tell us about it, just forgot about it. And the court then levied penal damages, which can be enforced in the US. So you don't want to ignore these kind of problems, and you have to be careful. But in the HR arena, mainly it's mishandling an employee. That's the main risk. You just have to be sure that the right documents and you play the issue, whatever it is, in the correct way, bearing in mind local regulations. They can also affect, funnily enough, non-employees. So for example, interviews. There are, obviously, we all know that there are questions that you cannot ask at interviews. But in some countries, there are even rules about whether or not an interview can be virtual. For example, in Netherlands, an employee can insist on a prospective employee, maybe a bit foolish, but a prospective employee can nevertheless insist on an in-person interview. And if you don't do it, that cannot be given as a reason for not selecting them.
Wow. So many things to think about. When you think about, Zoom meetings like this one, some people want to be on video, some people don't want to be on video, some people want in person. But when you have rules and regulations around it that say, you have rights to be able to ask for that, you need to know about that in the country that you're interviewing. Now, Tracee, I know you have got some examples because I think you just recently hired in Mexico. Can you share some of that with us and what that interview process looked like?
Yeah, when you step back and really look at the whole landscape of hiring and talent management globally, there really is a war for talent. And there's a war for top talent because you want people that have proven experience where they're going to come in and be successful. And for us, one of the things that was very important is we selected a recruiting firm that I've worked with in the past, and they do a phenomenal job, but they got key people that they sent to us in a timely manner. And it's very important with candidates that you interview them in a timely manner because there's a lot of other companies that are going to swoop in and grab them if you don't interview them. So we had multiple candidates we interviewed. We worked with our global recruiting firm, and we ended up working, our VP of Latin America ended up working with them as well and interviewing, and he did a great job, was really quick to get with the candidates, and we were able to make a hire, and this person's doing an excellent job. And so it's important as you're working on talent also that you manage the offer process properly, that you get that 13th and 14th month in pay for them, along with you as you look at your annual costs. So there's details to be managed, and it's important within those countries that you have those legal entities set up properly. And that's why Nucleus is so great to talk with.
Yeah. So Sean, walk us through what that looks like. How do you support, folks like Tracee and her organization to really take a look at talent? Because I'm guessing that it can really help to resolve some of the issues we're seeing right now in hiring and retention. But at the same time, there's a lot of rules and regulations that go along with that. So how do you support that process in taking a look at hiring in other locations. And what suggestions do you have for those in the audience today of where to start?
I think the key is to have good communication between the service provider like Nucleus and the client, so that the service provider is well aware of what's happening day to day and month to month. That is absolutely key. So for example, a good example, just taking Mexico as an example, during COVID, people worked from home. Well, the Mexican government introduced regulations governing work from home that put obligations on employers, both obligations on health and safety related obligations and also financial obligations. There were certain payments that employers have to make to people working from home in Mexico. So it's important at that point, let's say you've been engaged to help set Mexico up. It's important that you stay in touch with the client as a service provider and understand what is happening, especially when an event like a pandemic happens, that understand where these employees in this particular case are working from, figuring out what impacts them, advising the client well in advance that, hey, there's going to be impending legislation that covers working from home in this country. And when that legislation then becomes law, already figuring out what to do and how to do it. So I think the key, I'm using this pandemic in Mexico just as an example, but even if there was no pandemic and never had been, and it's not Mexico, but some other country, it's important to stay in touch regularly with the client so that you, the service provider, know what other things the client's doing and what, therefore, you need to advise the client to get your advice on, and then give them that advice. How do we give that advice? Well, we have a significant R&D operation that's about 1/3 of our workforce that's not chargeable, that actually maintains a knowledge base of this type of information that we can then draw on specifically to advise a client. That's how we do it. And of course, we have people in all the 58 countries where we operate that add to it.
And that's key, Shan, don't you think, having a person on the street in those countries that are, they eat, sleep, drink there, they understand the laws and regulations, and that's so critical just in being able to advise.
Yes, because there are two things. There's the regulatory requirements and there is the regulatory practice. And sometimes the practice the regulators can ask you to do things that are over and above what they're entitled to ask you in law, but is commonly abided by local. So an answer going back to them to say, well, the law doesn't require me to give it to you is not going to be a good answer because they're going to be reasons to come after you after that. Right. So you need to know what that regulatory practice is. And for that, you have to have a person on the street.
Yeah, Shan, I remember you helping us when I was at a tech company when we expanded into Germany. And I remember you advising us too that we had to plan 6 months or a year in advance to get that employee as they finished up their other job. They had to provide a pretty extensive amount of notice. And so little things like that matter. The other thing too, I think in the war on talent in hiring and attracting top people is making sure you keep in touch with that candidate. Keep them warm and keep them interested in the job, because sometimes it feels like there's this black hole. You go in and interview with a company and then you don't hear from them for a few months. And so communication is really important with those candidates. So just wanted to add those points.
Yeah, especially if that's considered rude in, another country, right?
Yeah.
You got to think about those things. All right. So let's put up our second poll for you guys to participate in. And then I'm going to go to audience questions. So the question that we have for you is, which of the following international employee issues would you like more information about? So let us know: global expansion, general payroll administration, taxes, VAT, expense claims, and stock options, and year-end compliance. We want to hear from you on that. Now, while that poll is happening and we're giving people or the audience a chance to weigh in, Rhonda has a question. So should all companies offer everyone a severance package when releasing employees, or is that more of a case-by-case company practice? I'm obviously not including this as part of a termination due to ethical issues. Shan?
It's a case-by-case. Because the person's right to severance, the amount of severance in most countries depends on the number of years they've worked for you. So it's a case by case basis, unfortunately. Also, you have to be careful if it's a one-off redundancy, you have to show that your choice of making that person to make redundant is based on sound and rational thinking and not on an individual prejudice. In other words, you don't like that person, so you want to get rid of that person. That won't work. But that person on a competency ranking is ranking lowest among the employees in that group, would be a good reason, and you have to reduce costs. That would be a good reason to make that person's, to sever that person. So you have to be very careful when you do that you do a competency assessment if you've got more than one employee to show that you've selected that person for redundancy on rational and objective grounds and not based on any personal or other prejudice.
I appreciate that. And I think that's important to note is that not only can Nucleus help with expansion globally, but if you've already expanded globally, you can actually help in making sure that they are compliant and make sure that moving forward, they're getting notifications of any changes that are happening. And as you grow, what else you need to know and how you can support them in that growth as well.
I used to joke actually that come to Nucleus for hirings, firings, births, deaths, and weddings.
You're funny.
Well,
All right.
yeah.
Did you want to add something, Tracee?
I was just going to say the one thing we know in business is things always change. And so being able to pivot and be agile and have feet on the street that can help you and advise you. And that's what I love about working with Shan is he can help you stay out of those pitfalls and those problems that could create challenges for the company.
Absolutely. And Rhonda says, thank you for your answer on that. Now, the results of poll number 2, 50% says global expansion is what they would like to have more information about. And then runner up is split 25%, 25% for taxes and year-end compliance. So there's a lot of people in the audience that are still looking for some more information. And so we're definitely going to reach out to you after this to be able to help you with that. Now, one of the other questions that we have from the audience and that I think is a really interesting question. Are non-compete agreements valid with international employees if the headquarters is in the US? Now, I know that in supply chain, we've had a lot of conversations about non-competes and how we shouldn't have non-competes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's why this one's kind of interesting for me. And I'm pretty sure the audience members, especially in supply chain, are interested in this answer. Which one of you wants to take that one?
I would add, I'd love Shan to take the bulk of it, but I would just say, in the US, many states are saying no more non-competes because when you get to a court setting or with a judge, oftentimes we can't take away the livelihood of that person. And it's important that they can continue to be able to do the work that they need to do. So globally, I think when you look at a case by case situation, if it's a bad policy in the US, it's probably a bad policy globally. But Shan, feel free to share some thoughts on that.
Well, non-competes are not quite that negative in abroad. In Europe, for example, in UK, you can have a non-compete with a reasonable chance of it sticking if you limit it to 3 months. In Netherlands, for example, you can have a non-compete for 3 months if it's a permanent employment and you can enforce it. But there are very specific rules. So for example, taking Netherlands, if you agree that non-compete and now you give the person a pay rise, the pay rise letter should restate the non-compete. Otherwise, there is a risk that a Netherlands employment court could throw out your non-compete. However, there is a way of getting the benefits of a non-compete without a non-compete, thinking outside the box. And the way you would do that is by agreeing 2 things with the employee: a long notice period and a garden leave provision, which originally was a very British thing. You basically pay the guy his notice period and just let him mow his lawn. So he's still employed by you, but so he can't work for somebody else. You have to pay him during that period, but he can't join anybody else and you've locked him out. And you can that way effectively have a non-compete for up to 6 months. You can pay, if it's sufficiently important to you, he's on the payroll for 6 months, having a holiday, cutting his lawn, but he can't work for somebody else. So it depends on how important that non-compete is. Non-competes also generally can work for senior personnel. but less likely to work for junior personnel.
Mhm.
So it very much depends on the facts and circumstances, but there are ways in which you can effectively effectively have a non-compete without actually calling it a non-compete.
And there's ways of doing that.
Yeah.
And each
Yes.
region or country has different rules around that. And even Tracee
Right.
is taking notes today. So
Yes, I am. I am. I learn all the time in this. I was just going to ask too, Shan, on along with non-competes, non-solicitation, because that's the one I get worried about too when you've got a team in those countries, if that person leaves, because some of the senior level people, as you know, have employment agreements,
Yes.
and you have
Yes.
kind of the employment end of that when they come and go all aligned. What are your thoughts on non-solicitation?
Non-solicitation is pretty easy to enforce in most countries.
Right.
Most, not all, but most.
Yes.
The risk with the non-compete is that if a judge throws it out, you've lost it completely.
Mhm.
Whereas the combination of the long notice period and garden leave is unlikely to be thrown out. Because you're paying him. He's getting some benefit from you for the period that he can't work for somebody else. His argument would be that he's losing his skill sets and therefore his attractiveness to the marketplace through this long period. But equally, the counter argument to that is that he should have thought about that before signing the employment agreement.
Mhm.
You know, he wasn't a baby and he had every ability to get legal representation. And particularly given the fact that you wouldn't agree something like this for anyone other than a senior person who's expected to have enough, more nouns, legal nouns and sensitivity than a junior person. So
Right.
those there are ways around it in some countries, but and the risk, generally I would discourage a non-compete, because if it's thrown out lock, stock and barrel and you have
Right.
nothing.
Right. Well, we are coming to the end of this discussion. We've only got about 4 minutes left, and I really want to end this with something that the audience can take away, either thinking about or putting into action. I'd like each one of you to weigh in on that. So Tracee, what would sum up this discussion? What would you like people walking away from this discussion with?
Well, I would just say people matter. And it's so important that you manage things correctly when you move into global expansion, depending on what country you go with. And having a subject matter expert like Nucleus and Shan and the team, as well as some of your other subject matter experts, is so important, because you can't keep your eye on everything in every single country. And it's so important that you get at the moment and get that information to help you to be more successful in managing it correctly.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Shan.
Mhm.
Two things: listen to your people.
Absolutely.
Don't tell them what to do. Listen to what they have to say. Filter out through what they say the bits that are relevant and implement them. Second, make sure you've got, and you would expect me to say this, that you have got good advisors, but it is true that you need proactive support, not reactive support.
Absolutely. All great advice, and definitely things that we want to walk away from this discussion thinking about. So thank you both, Tracee and Shan. I mean, the HR executive's role is ever changing, and new research from McKinsey says that now is the time for finance leaders to lead into that evolution and reassert themselves as strategic partners and digital enablers to their organization. As international expansion becomes less an option and more a necessity for many businesses, opening new revenue opportunities, giving life to mature products, and offering new ways to tackle some of the issues within the current volatile market. But with so many responsibilities on their plate, HR leaders will be glad to know they don't have to go it alone. Nucleus provides support through a one-stop integrated solution spanning multi-country accounting, payroll, compliance, HR, and legal, giving you flexibility and choice whilst minimizing risk. As promised, as a thank you for attending today, we will be sending you an ebook titled 2022 Global Expansion, Recovery, and Consolidation. So keep an eye out for that in your inbox. A big thank you to Nucleus for making this webinar happen and giving us a glimpse into the life of a VP of HR and the realities of managing an international expansion. expansion. If you'd like to find out more, head over to Nucleus. That's nucleus-co.com. And if you have any more questions or insights you'd like to share, feel free to reach out to all of us. So Shan, Tracee, and everybody in the audience, thank you so much for joining us today, and I'll see you again soon.
Thank you, Sarah. Bye-bye.